Okay, so now that we've gone over supply and demand and created each curve individually, this lesson we're going to be combining them together. We're going to be talking about market equilibrium and a little bit of policy. We're going to get into taxes and talk about how sometimes politicians will try to claim that a certain tax policy is going to lean one direction or target a certain group. And we're going to look at what really happens. So here's what we're going to be going over throughout this lesson. We're going to be combining supply demand, talk about what equilibrium means, be looking at what disequilibrium looks like. What happens when the market is not exactly in balance at equilibrium, and then all those changes and shifts that we were talking about the last two lessons. We're going to be looking at those again and applying what we learned from those. Then we're going to be talking about price ceilings and price floors. That's going to be connected to the disequilibrium. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, taxes. Okay, so let's dive into supply and demand, and let's combine both to create our supply-demand graph. Reaching back to that very first lesson, talking about who actually sets prices, we've already established sellers do not set prices, neither do buyers. They do not set prices by themselves. So then how does it happen? Okay, we're going to looking at this through the lens, and we're trying to really answer that question through the lens of the market for mowing. Okay, so we're going to set up. So the idea is you're going to charge $65 a lawn, or you're going to charge $5 a lawn. So this is the supply curve for the market for mowing. You have at least 5 people looking here. You have at least 5 people that are willing to, I'm just estimating there, 5 people that are willing to do it for $5, and then you have up to 25 people willing to do it for $65. And you just kind of guesstimate out there. On the demand side of the curve, for $65 here, we have 5 people. So it's $65 here. We have 5 people who are willing to have their lawn mowed for $65. Now again, the law of demand, as prices go down, demand goes up. So all the way here at $5, we have at least 25 people who are now willing to let someone mow their lawn as opposed to just doing it themselves. So when we combine the two, this is what we get. And we see how this interaction happens. So from this graph, we can begin to look at the market itself, look at where the price is, and say, okay, is this where the price should be? And from there, begin to make our own decisions. And what we call this right here is equilibrium. Now, going back to our question, is how are prices set? We can analyze that here. So if let's say the price is at $65, right? So we know that only 5 people are going to be willing to have their lawn mowed at that price, but we have 25 people are willing to mow the lawn at $65, right? So again, let's talk real quick about the law of supply and demand. When prices are high, demand is low. So only 5 people there. So we see that playing out correctly. And then on supply side, when price is high, supply is high. So at $65, 25 people are saying, hey, I could definitely make money doing that. So ultimately though, how does the market actually set the price? Which according to this, is estimating this out, is going to be around $35 is going to be our equilibrium price. So how do we get there? Really through negotiation. So some people are going to say, hey, just imagine, that, someone knocks on your door, calls you on the phone and says, hey, I want, I mow lawns and, I'll be in your neighborhood. I want to mow, if you need it, I'll mow your lawn for this amount. And as the consumer, you just say, well, is that too high or too low? And let's just say for this instance, that's too high. They want $65 to mow your lawn. You're like, man, I can't afford that. I'm sorry. And you say, will you do it for 25? And y'all begin to negotiate. What we're seeing here is that negotiation at an individual level is what we're talking about. But over time, the market, through all the interactions between buyers and sellers, between all the people on the demand side, all the people on the supply side, all those interactions, all the wheeling and dealing, eventually you'll see the price get walked down all the way down to this equilibrium price. We can also see this on the opposite side. Let's say the price was set too low at $5. Okay, there's going to be plenty of people, right? It's a law of demand. When price is low, demand is high. So there's going to be plenty of people, 25 people, who want their lawn mowed. But there's only going to be about 5 people, probably a bunch of little, middle schoolers who are trying to save up for whatever game console they want to buy. They're willing to do it for $5 because they have almost zero overhead. But as you begin to move up in price, that's when you get the lawn businesses that have a little bit more overhead who need to make a little bit more for it to be profitable. But that same phenomenon, as we can see here, is what's going to take place just like it did when the price was set too high. The wheeling and dealing, people saying, okay, well, I'll give I'll pay it $5 to mow my lawn. Well, I can't do it for that. Man, I really don't want to mow my lawn. It's 105 degrees outside. Okay, how about 25? Well, how about 50? I can't do 50. Okay, what about? And then they eventually get down to equilibrium at $35. That's how prices are set in a free market economy. So ultimately, like we've said before and how I've kind of been alluding to, at both ends, whether the price is set too high or set too low, both will eventually begin to walk down or walk the price up depending on the situation, and they'll get to this equilibrium point. Now, equilibrium, what is equilibrium? This is where supply and demand equal themselves, which is where quantity demanded and quantity supplied equal themselves. So again, that's more economies, as I call it. So what does that mean? That means that at equilibrium, in real world language, is that this is where every buyer who wants this product is going to buy at that price. And this is where every seller who wants to provide this product, in this case mowing, is willing to sell. It's that perfect equilibrium. There's not going to be someone left out saying, "Hey, well, I wanted my lawn mowed, but there wasn't enough people mowing lawns." There's not going to be people like, "Hey, I was wanting to mow a lawn, but all the lawns have been mowed, and there's no one left that has a lawn that needs to be mowed." This is a perfect spot in this market where everyone's needs, people providing it, people providing and selling, people wanting to buy. This is where everyone's needs and wants are met. Now, in reality, is it possible that we find that perfect equilibrium price? No, right? Markets fluctuate. We're going to be talking about changes in market, and we've already talked about things that shift the market here. This world is constantly moving. The economy is constantly going. But does that mean that we can't get close to equilibrium price? No, we can't. So that's that's the idea behind this whole thing is, okay, what can we do? What policies can we set to try to hit that equilibrium? Okay, let's move into disequilibrium. And when we have disequilibrium, it means that we're operating at a price that's not at equilibrium. And so what is that called? And as you can read from the title, that gives us surpluses and shortages. So let's dive into each of those. Okay, market disequilibrium. When we get to shortages, this is when we're operating under or at a price that's under equilibrium. Kind of how I tell my students is just focus on the word short. When you're short, you're under. If you're short and listening to this, I do apologize, but the analogy holds. So if you're short, you're under things. So this price is under equilibrium. And as we can see, when prices are under, based off the law of supply and demand, quantity supplied is going to be lower at a lower quantity. And people are going to be wanting to take advantage of those low prices if you're a consumer, so demand is going to be high. And so this box right here, which you can, eventually we're going to be able to put some math to that to figure out exactly what that shortage is. And don't get all nervous about the math. The math is simple. It's simply the surface area of a rectangle, length times width. So simple multiplication. So when we have a shortage here, we can use this formula. This formula will tell us real quick whether we're at shortage or surplus. So if it's a shortage, and we run this, oh, let me take it off. If it's a shortage and we run this formula and we get a negative, we know it's a shortage. So you take your quantity supplied, minus it by your quantity demanded. If your answer is a negative, again, which means your quantity supplied is lower than your quantity demanded, you'd obviously get a negative. That's a shortage. So let's look at the flip side. On the flip side, we have market equilibrium at a surplus. Surplus is any price that we're operating above equilibrium. This means that there's plenty of people who want to sell, who love to sell you whatever good this is, but there's not going to be as many people willing to buy it because the price is so high. We're starting to see that a little bit in our economy right now. Inflation has made prices go up, and so supermarkets are having to throw away food in record numbers because people aren't buying as much as they once were, so they're beginning to have these surpluses, and food goes bad over time, and so they toss it. So just like before, we can use the same formula. So at whatever price point you're looking at, you take your quantity supplied minus your quantity demanded, and if your answer is a positive one, then you have a surplus. And then we also have this handy dandy chart that helps us figure out what we're looking at. So there's really three ways you can look at it. You can look at your graph and just draw from the price point it tells you. If it's above equilibrium, it's a surplus. If your line is drawn below equilibrium, you're a shortage. You can run you can run the numbers in the formula, or you can just look at it where if quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, you have a shortage. If they're equal to each other, yes, that's that perfect equilibrium. And then when you have whenever quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied, you have a surplus. Okay, now let's look at what happens when we begin to change our demand and supply. Now we're going to lean on demand here, and the reason we don't have a second section for supply is because it's going to be a mirror image. It's going to do the same thing just on the supply side. So you would use all those different non-price determinants that we talked about in the last lesson for supply. It's going to shift things left. It's going to shift things right depending on the situation, just like it does with demand and its non-price determinant. So we're going to lean on demand, but just know you can take all those non-price determinants of supply and you're going to be shifting left and shifting right. Remember, an increase is always going to be a shift to the right, and a decrease, in whichever you're looking at, supply or demand, will always be a shift to the left. So let's dive into this. So when we have a shift or a change in demand, here we have an increase. So you can see here, we have our demand curve 1, where we're starting, and whatever happens, right? Let's say it's taste and preferences, and people hear that, hey, drinking is, let's just pretend this is orange juice. And orange juice is going to help lower your cholesterol. So now more people are going to be demanding orange juice. We have that shift to the right. This could be a population increase. Right, all of a sudden, more people move into a town, and milk is going to be on everyone's grocery list. So there's going to be more of a demand for milk. So again, we have a shift to the right. Okay, so then what does that mean to the market itself? So we have this shift to the right, like we just talked about from here to here. And then we're operating under the original, for a while at least, we're operating under the original equilibrium. And so what does that create? Now that we've shifted to here and we've determined that this is where our new equilibrium is going to be, what does that mean we're operating under? That means we're operating under a shortage. And over time, this isn't an overnight thing, but you'll begin to see the price rise and go up because demand has gone up. And now it's created more of an incentive for producers to produce more milk. And eventually, we get to this new equilibrium price here, and this becomes our new equilibrium. So all that wheeling and dealing that we saw, again, it doesn't have to be you're arguing with the grocer, since we're using milk as an example, but different factors begin to shift the market, and eventually we get to this new equilibrium price. That's why a lot of times you'll see those memes where it shows a price 5 cents a gallon, right? And And now now we're paying, if you live in Texas and you're taking this class, you're paying around a little under $3 a gallon. Whereas I remember hearing stories of my grandfather driving away at 19 cents a gallon because that was in his words, too damn high. So basically what we have here is, as factors change, whether it be inflation, in this case, again, we're making things up for this particular example, population increases. It could be any of those factors. Over time, we typically will see price begin to move up. Now, does that mean that we're just paying more and that just stinks? No. Typically, as prices increase over time, so do wages. And so, yes, if you account for inflation, we're still paying more than what they used to in the past. But we're not paying. It's not as astronomically high as it seems just looking at the raw numbers. But ultimately, that's what's happening here, is we have a shift in demand creating a shortage. So people are going to be needing more than what's going to be supplied. Prices begin to rise. It incentivizes suppliers to begin to produce more. And then we eventually get to this new equilibrium spot. Ideally, this is how the free market works when left alone. So in this slide, it basically is just showing that phenomenon we just spoke about, that the market is beginning to stretch out and the new equilibrium is here. And so this is where we're going to be operating under a new price. So it looks like around $48 here is going to be our new equilibrium price for whatever product this represents. And it's going to be about 19 people wanting to buy it. Okay, so let's move into what we call complex changes. And what we mean by that is just simply when supply and demand move at the same time. There's a term that you might read in the book, or in the online book rather. It's a term that I heard a million times going through all my courses in economics. Cerebus paribus, loosely translated, it's Latin. Loosely translated means things unchanged, or all things being equal, depending on how you want to look at it. But in reality, is that really the case? Does one thing happen and everything else remain constant? No, we live in a world that's constantly changing, constantly moving. So what happens when both things change at the same time? Ultimately, it just depends on what takes place. So if we think back to I can't go back in this platform, but if we think back to the supply demand graph where we had demand just moving to the right, what happens if something changes and moves the supply curve to the left, right? It shifts it left, or maybe it shifts right as well. That's what we call a complex change, when two things, or maybe even sometimes three things, four things, depending on your assignment, you may have multiple shifts happening all at the same time. And we can use these principles to then analyze what's going to happen to equilibrium. And that's really the ultimate goal of all this, is where does equilibrium fall? Did the prices go down? Did the prices go up? We won't know until every shift happens and we see where it falls. Okay, so let's talk about some policy here. So from this point on, we're going to be talking about some different government policies that are used, and we can analyze their effect looking at the supply-demand graph. So first up, we have price ceilings. A price ceiling is simply a legal maximum that a good or service can be sold or purchased at. Kind of a classic example of a price ceiling is rent control. And whenever I'm teaching this class in person, we talk about New York and LA and San Francisco, and how a lot of areas have what they call rent control, meaning that once you've bought, or once you've leased or rented an apartment, they're not allowed to go up on your rent more than a very small percent every year, despite what the actual market says. And so it sets a legal maximum for the price that they can actually charge for the rent. I believe that we're going to be using slices of pizza here. So we'll just go with their example. So the price for pizza is $6 a slice. Okay. But we're going to set a price ceiling at $3 a slice. So what does a price ceiling create, or really what we call a binding price ceiling? We'll talk about that here in a second. Okay, so whoever made this slide apparently doesn't care to keep the numbers the same as what we just talked about, but we're going to go with it. So equilibrium price here is at $3.50, but we're going to create a price ceiling at around $2, thus creating a shortage. Price ceilings or binding price ceilings create a shortage. What we mean by binding is if the price ceiling prevents the market from moving into the equilibrium price. So here at $2 is where our price ceiling is set. Our equilibrium price for pizza should be here at $3.50. So this is what we call a binding price ceiling. Let's say the price ceiling was set at $5. Well, are we going to really worry about that one at this moment? No, because no one's going to really want to buy pizza at $5 because they're going to want to be getting it at $3.50, which is again the equilibrium price. So this is just simply this would be a non-binding price ceiling, where what we're dealing with here, just take that away so we're not confused. What we're dealing with here is a binding price ceiling at $2 because it is keeping the price from moving into equilibrium. So a binding price ceiling creates a shortage every single time. To just kind of give you a little visual here, a price ceiling, just like the regular, if you started to float, like let's say gravity was turned off for a moment and you begin to float, what's going to keep you from floating out into the sky? If you're inside right now, it's going to be the ceiling. So just think of it that way. A price ceiling prevents the prices from going too high. It prevents prices from going any higher than that ceiling allows. Okay, so now let's move into price floors. And they're going to have the opposite effect of what a price ceiling has. So here we have the same type of illustration, but it's showing that a price floor prevents prices from falling too low, where a price ceiling prevents prices from rising too high. A price floor will prevent prices from going lower than what is deemed allowable. So here we have our definition of price floor, which is a legal minimum price set where the prices can't go any lower than that. And minimum wage. So when we begin to flirt with the idea of setting a price floor on anything, not just minimum wage, we're going to use minimum wage as the example, but anytime we do that, we're going to essentially set up a surplus. You can see that right here. Because what we're doing is we're keeping the prices from falling lower into what would be the equilibrium price for that market. And for whatever reason we've deemed that that's too low, we just need to recognize by making that decision and making that policy, we are essentially saying, okay, then we are okay with what we call a surplus in labor. Another way of saying that is unemployment. The surplus in labor means that there's more labor available than there are jobs on the market. So we've, in an effort to try to essentially say, hey, we're going to help people out, we're going to raise their wages, what ultimately are we doing? We're saying, okay, businesses now have to pay more. So what if they can't afford to pay more and keep their doors open, what's their solution? They could try all sorts of stuff, right? And we would like to think that they would, but ultimately, if it comes down to it, they're going to have to start letting people go. And so we begin to see people lose their jobs. This happens this has happened every time we've risen the minimum wage. Now, does that mean that it's permanent? No, of course not. Over time, we begin to see our unemployment level playing out and begin to drop back down. Take minimum wage out of it for a second. Make this a market for whatever you want to. We've set a price floor, keeping the price from dropping below this point to what would be equilibrium. We've created a surplus of goods. You have more people willing to sell the good than you have people willing to buy the good. And so now we have a surplus of goods. And again, so now depending on what this is, if it has a long shelf life, it may not be as big a deal if we're talking about products just sitting there waiting to be sold. But if it's like something like food, this may cause a problem because it doesn't have as long of a shelf life. And now we're just simply throwing things away. So just to recap before we move on to the next topic, we have price ceilings, prevent prices from going higher than what's been set, and price floors keep prices from falling lower than what's being set. A price ceiling or a binding price ceiling that keeps the price from going to the equilibrium will create a shortage, and a binding price floor, like we see here, keeps the price from going down to equilibrium, creating a surplus. Okay, so the last thing we're going to be talking about is taxes and what taxes do to the market. And we're also ultimately going to be looking at who is going to be paying taxes. You'll hear politicians say, we're going to tax the supplier, we're going to tax Amazon or whoever it may be. But economically speaking and looking at it through the lens of supply demand, who's actually going to be paying these taxes? The answer may surprise you. So whenever politicians enact taxes, what we have, and this is going to be a tax on suppliers. So they're going to enact a $4 tax. So if we look here, we're just simply going to move from our original supply curve. We're going to go up $4 to here, and we would just simply draw our new supply curve. So this is our supply curve. ST is supply curve with the tax. And so now we can see here, plain as day, that our equilibrium has moved from here to here. And so we're actually now paying, or the equilibrium price now is moved up from $10 to $12. But how do we see the tax? Where's the tax coming from? This is where we see where the tax is. This square right here, this rectangle rather, right here is the tax revenue being taken. And how you draw that is after you've drawn your new supply curve, you simply go your demand curve where the new equilibrium is, and we draw a straight line down to the old original supply curve, and then we just simply go to the prices, and that creates our tax revenue area. And as we can see here, this rectangle represents our tax revenue, and from $8 to $12 is obviously $4. So this represents our $4 tax. So ultimately, looking at this, let me erase this so we can see. Looking at this, who is actually going to be paying this tax? How we determine that is we go to our original equilibrium and just draw a line all the way to there, and then we look at the difference. Who's ever paying more is the one that's actually paying the burden. So whenever we enact a tax on suppliers, in this case, and again, we'll get into elasticity and looking at when these lines aren't a perfect 45-degree angle. But in this example, who's ultimately carrying the burden? It's both the supplier and the okay, fix that. It's both the supplier and the consumer. Both are equally paying the tax. So keep that in mind next time we hear someone say, well, we're just going to tax this particular group of people, whether it be the producer or the seller or, tariffs. When we get to international trade, tariffs are the same way. You'll hear President Trump famously enacted a bunch of tariffs on China, but ultimately, who's going to end up paying that? Now, again, if you agree with that or not, that's not what we're talking about. But we can't deny the fact that whoever it is, back in the past, you had Democrat presidents. So again, I'm not drawing party lines here. Whenever you enact a tariff, whether you're on a Republican or a Democrat, doesn't matter. When you enact a tariff, ultimately, part of, not the full, right? As we can see here, it's not fully on the supplier. It's not fully on the consumer. Both parties are going to carry the burden. Tariffs are the same way. Yes, China is going to pay part of those tariffs, but so are we, the American people, because China's just going to try to raise their prices, and then we're going to find that new equilibrium price. China's not going to be earning as much as they once were, and we're not going to be getting a better price that we once were. Both are going to end up sharing the burden. So if that's what happens when you enact a tax on a supplier, what happens when you enact a tax on the demanders or the consumer? So just like we did before, we have a $4 tax, but now we're going to tax people when they buy the certain good, right? A kind of example of this is sometimes you do a consumption tax on big ticket luxury items, like we'll say yachts. So let's say there's going to be a $4 tax on a luxury item. Make up your own luxury item. What do? So you start with your original demand curve, and you just simply you go down $4, and you draw a new demand curve at the exact same slope. So in this case, it's an even 45-degree slope. And you get your demand with the tax. And it's going to be the exact same process as a tax on suppliers. You simply go to your new demand curve and you draw up to your old one, and that creates your tax revenue. And again, let's look at who's going to pay the burden. You go to your original demand curve. We're going to talk about what this is later in the class. This is what we call deadweight loss, this spot here in the middle. But to check out who's paying the burden, you just go to your original equilibrium, you draw that line straight, and you look and you see and you split the difference between your center point. So in this case, again, a tax on consumers or the demanders of this product is still going to equate to an even split of the burden. You're going to have consumers paying $2 of this tax, and you're essentially, in the form of not getting as much for their product, you're going to have $2 being paid by the supplier. So in both cases, again, this kind of just shows everything we just talked about. So it has it drawing out the line here. It has it drawing out the line here. So a tax on suppliers, the government earns $4 a unit. And again, we can figure out what that exact amount is by taking the surface area of this rectangle, length times width. Okay, consumers are now going to pay $2 more than they were before. Originally, right, they were paying $10. Now they're going to pay $12. And producers are going to receive $8 per unit, where before they were getting $10 per unit. So it's an even split with the burden, and the government, obviously Uncle Sam, will get his. So if we look at the demand on the demand side of this, we have the exact same phenomenon here. $4 to the government. We have $12 is going to what the consumer is going to. We have $12 that the consumer is going to pay, and then we have $8 that the producer is going to receive. And again, we draw this out. We look, okay, who's paying more of the burden? Nobody. It's an equal split. So keep this in mind next time we hear about a politician or a city council is going to raise taxes because we're going to, someone needs to, or we're going to cut that last part. So keep this in mind next time we talk about we're raising taxes for whatever reason. It could be for a new school. It could be for a new park. It could be something that everyone loves the idea for. But when we're told that, hey, well, we're only going to tax more on these particular people, it's not just going to be them. There's always going to be a split of the burden. Now, when we get into elasticities, this even split is not always the case. Sometimes someone is going to pay more of that tax, but that doesn't mean that the other side of the equation is left alone completely. There's always going to be a small amount that's going to be split. Okay, so this ends our lesson on equilibrium and looking at policy in the form of taxation, price ceilings, and price floors.